right, time to start, y'all. Well, welcome back. We are now moving on into chapter 9 in Esther. We're getting down to it, down to the end here. We're, of course, going to start like we normally do. We're going to do a little recap of chapter 8. Does anybody want to volunteer some of the highlights that happened in the last chapter? What are some of the important things that happened? What happens at the beginning there? We know Haman is now dead. He's been impaled on a stake at his own courtyard. What happens to his home and his estate, I guess, if you will? Right. The king gifts Esther Haman's house. This would be not just his physical home, but all of his property, everything he owns, which we would assume would be pretty sizable, right? I mean, he's just offered 10,000 talents of silver to wipe out the Jews, so we know he had quite a bit of money. So this is not an insignificant gift. And what does Esther do with it? She sets Mordecai over this. So it seems Mordecai's fortunes have dramatically reversed as well. What else do we see happening in this chapter? Yeah, we'll need the in his clothing. Yeah, we see that. He's elevated to the number 2 guy in the kingdom, Haman's position. He's been given. We also see Esther again going before the king, don't we? Apparently unsummoned yet again because the king has to raise his scepter out. So she's getting pretty comfortable doing this, I guess. Again, we remember that was kind of a dangerous thing to be doing if you came before the king unsummoned. So we see that again. And what does she ask for? That's coming up. Yeah. At this time, she comes before the king, and she asks for him straight up to reverse the edict that Haman had made. And what does he tell her? Basically, yes. He says, "I've given you Haman's life and his property. I'll also allow you to write a new edict, but I can't undo this." So he allows her and Mordecai to come up with this new edict that, as we know, allows the Jews to gather together and to defend themselves on that day of the massacre. Let's see here. That pretty much kind of wraps up chapter 8. At the end, you see the Jews. They've come from being in a state of terror and panic to now they have cause for joy and celebration. Does anybody have any thoughts on the chapter or some maybe lessons or anything that they took from it? You must have done a great job, John. All right, well, we'll move on into chapter 9 then. I'm going to go ahead and start off by reading the first 5 verses. So, all right. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, in the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. All right, so you've got two sides. They've been preparing for this for months, about 9 months, getting ready to go at it here. We don't get a whole lot of detail about the battle, do we? I mean, we get some numbers, but we don't really know exactly how it went down. We do know the Jews come together in all their cities, don't we? It's not just that the Jews were able to defend themselves, but they were actually able to form these little armies around the province to take care of this. And I think that's a pretty significant point. What government would allow little armies or militias to just pop up and kill whoever they needed to without them being in direct control? I think it's kind of a unique event, I'd say. It says that no man could withstand them, and I think that makes sense too, doesn't it? You're fighting for your survival, whereas your enemy is more fighting for monetary gain or something like that. I think you're probably going to fight a little bit harder if your life is really on the line here. Not just your life, but your family's lives. So, it also says that the fear of all the people was upon them. And that also makes sense considering this huge reversal of fortune that they've just had. The Jews weren't very powerful a few months ago, were they? They weren't really much of anything in the kingdom. Now the queen is suddenly a Jew. The number 2 guy is a Jew. You've had this reversal of this edict. That's probably enough to put fear into a lot of people, this sudden rise of formerly not really well-known or group of people. And then, so what do we see because of this? What do a lot of the Persians end up doing? Yeah, they're pretending to be Jews. The princes and the officials are giving them help in whatever form that takes. We don't have an exact idea of what that it could be. Maybe money or equipment, or it could have very well been men to help fight. We don't know for sure, but the princes and the officials do end up helping the Jews, not only because of this reversal, but also because of their respect for who? Mordecai. Yeah. We don't get a whole lot of information on what he's done in the meantime, but it appears that the people of the kingdom are grown to kind of respect this guy. So he had the same power as Haman, obviously, but he's obviously wielding it in a different sort of way. So the Jews totally defeat those who stand against them. We're in chapter 9. We're in the beginning of chapter 9 here. Yeah. So that kind of takes us through the first 5 verses. What thoughts do y'all have on this here? Any comments on this first section? Yeah.
I just see I envision a change in the community. I imagine you have your Persians of birthright, and then you have these conquered communities that they're vying for, and you have enemies of that enemy but now they're all enslaved by the Persians and stuff. So I can just see this change of power and leadership and guidance, and people having to take aware and make decisions for their own life's sake.
Yeah, you can imagine there's a lot of uncertainty kind of swirling around the whole situation at this point. First we're killing the Jews, now they can kill people back. Haman is second in command, now it's Mordecai, and what's going on here? All along, these two sides are getting ready to do battle. So turbulent times in Persia, for sure. Does anybody else have any comments on that? All right, well, let's move along and read the next few verses. I'm going to read 6 through 15 here. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon, and Aspatha and Poratha, and Adalia and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Erisai, and Aradai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they laid no hand on the plunder. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "In Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued for Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. All right, so more bloodletting, more death and destruction. The Jews kill 500 men, including the 10 sons of Haman, just in the palace alone, just in the citadel in Susa. And then, the 10 sons of Haman here are listed by name. If you look at some of the Jewish traditions, I know like we said, we've got to be kind of skeptical about it, but tradition says that they were actually all hanged or impaled on the same stake, one on top of the other. So kind of a gruesome image, but when Jews are reading this verse during the Feast of Purim, it's kind of a weird thing. They have to read all of those names that I spouted off in one breath, because it's like a tradition. Because they were killed together, you've got to read all their names together without taking a breath. So kind of a weird little tidbit about the sons of Haman. Their names don't really have much significance for us, do they? I mean, they're just more names, and we don't know who they were. But at the time this was written, the people who would be reading this would have definitely known who the sons of Haman were. These were definitely rich and powerful and significant men in the Persian kingdom. What else is significant here? Brian?
Well, I noticed that Queen Esther's edict written on behalf of the king was almost a mirror image of Haman's edict. The primary difference being that Haman's ordered or allowed the attack of the Jewish people, whereas Esther's was to defend themselves. But they could have taken plunder, and that was the primary motive, I think, of the citizens to attack the Jews. But the Jews didn't take any plunder, and I thought that was significant.
Exactly. That's definitely what I was reaching for there. They didn't take any plunder. I mean, and the edict by Haman, like you said, it allowed the Persians who were attacking the Jews to take plunder. The letter that Mordecai, his edict had, allowed the Jews. The king allowed the Jews to take plunder, and yet they didn't do it. Why do y'all think that is?
They had the right to.
They did. They had the right to. They could have taken it. Why didn't they? I think that's exactly right. I think that's the logical, obvious conclusion. It's to show that their motivations are pure, right? They're only concerned with protecting their lives and not enriching themselves with the plunder. Like we read earlier already, the whole kingdom is in fear of them at this point. So an act like this could show that you had no bad intentions toward the rest of the people as well. So, yeah.
I think what strikes me thought is what gets recorded for history. and how this is read in, days and years past, and how it's looked upon. And then I also can't help but thinking earlier thoughts of people joining up, as we saw from when the nation left Israel, or not Israel, Egypt, and then they conquered along the way. People knew, hey, if their God is with them, you don't have a chance. And when their failure came about, it was recorded that God was not with them. So there's a respect and understanding and a knowledge of the one true God, and that carries through, that people in generations of other lands would know if their God is with them, they're not going to be touchable.
I think that's a great point. I think there's probably quite a bit of that going on in the kingdom at this point. I mean, how else do you explain what's happened here? So, excellent point. We also see that the king is informed of the body count here. They tell him how many it was. I'm sure he probably would have wanted to keep an eye on this event as it was unfolding. I mean, I can't imagine a scenario like this. A government basically saying that, all right, you two groups that don't like each other, on this day, you just go at it, and whoever wins, wins. It's like the makings of a movie, like The Purge or something like that. It's so bizarre. But you definitely want to keep abreast of this situation, wouldn't you, if you were the leader? This is the kind of thing that has the potential to spiral out of control and turn into mass violence. So, we see here Xerxes kind of keeping up with what's going on. We see that the day's final body count is at what in the palace in Susa? 500 people in just in the palace. That seems like kind of a lot. Now the palace was pretty big. It covers about 100 acres in that city, so you can fit a lot of people in there. There were a lot of people living inside it, but it still seems that 500 people in just that area, that's quite a lot. And the king expresses dismay at the number, but he also seems to understand that more is going to be necessary. What does he do? Yep. He doesn't even wait for her to ask. He says, "What do you want? I'm going to grant your request. Tell me what you want." And that's where she asks for Haman's sons to be hung on the gallows, and also for another day of battle. So he grants her request, and then what happens the next day? How many? 300 more. Yeah. A lot of people think that these 300 that were killed are not necessarily people that were living still in the palace. As we recall, Susa had the gated, walled fortress, and then there was the city surrounding it. A lot of people think that the people in the palace that wanted to do the Jews wrong had already been wiped out. This 300 was from outside the walls, so they went outside the walls to kill 300 more. Why ask for Haman's son on a stake like that? That seems pretty brutal for a request. Yeah, absolutely. It's a definite warning to others to not mess with the Jews. They've got the power now. Yeah, Brian.
This somewhat also reminds me of Joshua's invasion of the Promised Land, in that the Jews were heavily outnumbered and not a very powerful people relative to the power of the Canaanites in the Promised Land. You know that that Jews in Persia are heavily outnumbered, yet you could see, and as we'll find out later, they were very, very victorious.
Yeah, they won big. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this? Yeah. Did I see another one back there? Oh, Robert, okay. Oh, all right.
So I think one of the things that's interesting, we're talking about, I think Ahasuerus is surprised by this 500 number, and I think it dawns on him that maybe this was a bigger problem than he realized, that Haman is basically recruited a lot of people to his cause, but the power that he had. And so when he immediately offers up to Esther, like, oh man, we got 500 people just right here in the citadel. What do you want to do now? I think he's realizing that there's a bigger problem within his kingdom. As we've talked about, he's kind of a hands-off kind of guy anyway.
Right.
So I think the realization is kind of hitting him a little bit as far as that's concerned. And I also think that with the Jews not taking the plunder, to Brian's point, when they went into the promised land, this is one of those kind of undertones, like we know that this is a story about God, despite God not being mentioned. They were told when they went into the promised land, when you defeat your enemies, you don't take their plunder, because then that can potentially influence you to move away from being the people, my people, that you're supposed to be. And I also think on a personal front, if I'm defending myself from people who hate me, I don't want their stuff in my house. Like that, to me, it's a product of you and the hate that you have. I don't want it. Like,
Yeah.
no interest in it. So I think there's a lot of fronts and a lot of facets on this whole the Jews didn't take the plunder thing.
Yeah, absolutely, it could be true. You know, there's just so much we don't really get. You know, there's a lot of things that may be left to the reader to ponder. But I think there's absolutely a lot of that going on. Okay, Robert. Yeah.
The other thing that I think I'm seeing here in verse 12 of chapter 9 is we don't see that Esther has to have the scepter extended to her. It seems like she and Mordecai, even all the way back to chapter 8, have now taken up a somewhat more exalted level of in the king's presence, and maybe that's also a turning point. Back to the point we just heard, a more involved King Ahasuerus, but also a more prominent, which we already read about with Mordecai. So it just seems like this is an elevation of the Jews' capability in the people now.
Yeah, could be, for sure. We don't see the scenario like we have the previous times with her interactions with the king. So it could be that as well. H.E.?
The point that I was going to point out is Haman, and all the evil he does here, not only gets himself killed, but he gets his 10 sons killed. And I think that's a point to us that as fathers, mothers, we have a huge impact on our kids, and we can lead them even farther away from even God and the things that we're doing.
That's a great point. And it's not just his family either. I mean, we're going to see 75,000 people end up getting killed here, because of one man's pride setting all this off. So that's a great point too. One of the key lessons of this whole book, I think. All right, does anybody else have anything?
I guess just building on something Dustin said, I think there's still a threat, even after day one, and maybe there's no laws on the next day, but there's still hate and there's still an obvious threat to the Jewish people, and maybe even to Esther.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and deal with this problem right now before they have time to recover from this. Yeah. Howard.
Curious if they were only to kill if they were attacked, and so I went back to chapter 8, verse 11.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, the very last. So it says, to annihilate any armed force or of any people or province that might attack them, and then children and women included, and to plunder their goods. That was in the edict. So I wonder, was it Mordecai and Esther didn't plunder the goods, or I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm just curious if like none of the Jews took plunder, or just in this case on Haman's sons, they didn't.
I think
take
it's none of the
plunder.
Jews, and we're going to read some more because
Verse 16.
the same thing happens here on this next day. So let's go ahead and read verse 16 through 19 here. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. But they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th, making that day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So there you go. Yeah, none of the Jews took any of the plunder, despite killing 75,000. That's a lot of killing. 75,000 people in 1 to 2 days. That has actually become sort of a point of contention in this book among the so-called scholars out there. They think that number's too high. And there was one translation that translated it as only being 15,000, which some seem to find to be more believable. I personally think the bigger number is the real thing when you consider the size of the empire. I mean, you've got this thing stretches from India on one side to the borders of Greece on the other, down to Ethiopia in Africa, 127 provinces. 500 alone are killed in the citadel. So, in my opinion, the 75,000 number is a lot more likely. But there are still those that kind of think that that's inflated. Like we said before, there are many who kind of believe this isn't really an inspired book, more of a Jewish propaganda letter. So this is one of the things they use as a point towards them.
This was not the Jews out on the slaughter. They were allowed to defend themselves. They killed 75,000 of their attackers.
Right. Right. We don't see any mention of it. I mean, it seems unlikely that they would have come through this unscathed, but we don't have any count as to how many they might have lost, or if they lost any. We've seen when God is on your side, some pretty incredible victories are won throughout the Old Testament without any losses whatsoever. So we just don't have that number. Could have been some. Again, like we said, it's repeated that they didn't take any spoil, and the day after it's over, they make into a day of feasting and celebration. And it's interesting that they celebrated it on different days, just to include the guys that had to go out that second day and kill those 300 more men. So they celebrated on the 14th day of Adar and on the 15th. It said that the people who live in the villages and the small towns celebrated the day before, and the people who live in the walled cities, they celebrated on that second day. Any thoughts on that? Comments on that? All right. Okay, so we're moving right along. Let's go ahead and look at verse 20 and through verse 22. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies. And as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. All right, so he sends out this letter. This is the instituting of the Feast of Purim here, to be celebrated by both days by all Jews now, not just the ones on one day and the ones on the other. And amazingly, it's still a festival that's celebrated to this very day by Jews all over the world. It's kind of considered to be more of a minor festival compared to like Hanukkah or some of the others. Work is still permitted to be done on these days. I had a little thing I found about it, kind of interesting. It says, the main feature of Purim is the unique chanting of the Megillah, or the Scroll of Esther, both evening and morning, with its accompanying blessings and hymns. The 4 verses of redemption are read. That would be chapter 2, verse 5, chapter 8, verses 15 and verse 16, and then chapter 10, verse 3, and they're read in a louder voice than the other verses. It is customary for the children to hiss and boo and stamp their feet and make noises with specially made rattles every time the name of Haman is mentioned. When the name of Esther or Mordecai is mentioned, they cheer. At some celebrations, an effigy of Haman is burned. At least 2 portions of food, often confectionery, is sent to a friend, and one must give a present of money to at least 2 poor men. A special festive meal is eaten on Purim evening of boiled beans and peas, commemorating Daniel's pulse diet in Daniel 1, verse 12, and 3-cornered pies known as Hamantashen, or Haman's ears. One Jewish Babylonian teacher named Rava has said that a man is obliged to drink so much wine on Purim that he becomes incapable of knowing whether he is cursing Haman or blessing Mordecai. The more ascetic-minded rabbis try to explain this away, but liberal imbibing of alcohol is generally encouraged on Purim. Among the masses, it became almost a general rule that on Purim everything is allowed. It became customary to have plays and carnivals on the days, and people dressed up in costumes, fancy dresses, and masquerading. So, sounds like a pretty big shindig, and even to this day, we see it. Does anybody have any more information on Purim? Yeah.
I was going to ask, do you know what day on our calendar it falls, or what days?
So what day was Adar, the month of Adar?
12th month of the Jewish calendar.
Do we remember? Yeah, it's in March. I don't know the exact day that the Feast of Purim is on, because it doesn't match up exactly to our calendar, but it's on the 15th, the 14th and 15th day of that month. So
Immediately preceding Easter or Passover, because it's the 12th month.
okay, yeah. So yeah, still a thing to this very day. We're going to read a little bit more about it here in the next few verses. Let's go ahead and read some. Did somebody? I see a hand over here. Yeah, Robert.
I was just going to say, it seems a little bit odd that the Babylonians would have allowed this celebration now of this uprising or defense to happen, because we already talked about the fact that it was unusual to let them, kind of defend themselves. It just seems like you're encouraging another level of solidarity and uniqueness inside the kingdom that you wouldn't necessarily want to propagate. So it just seems odd.
Who's in charge now, though? Xerxes is in charge, but who's the number 2 guy at this point? When this Mordecai, yeah. So even if they didn't like it, this is yeah. And Esther's the queen, so even if the Persians didn't like it, I mean the Jews are clearly in kind of control of this situation. So that's what we see Mordecai doing, instituting this feast. All right. Anything else? Yeah, John.
Are you going to talk about John chapter 5?
I'm going to let you talk about John chapter 5.
So, in John chapter 5, verse 1, it says, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Of course, this is when he heals the lame man. And in verse 9, it says that he did this on the Sabbath. And the only feast of minor report between AD 25 and 35 was the Feast of Purim in AD 28. It was the only time one of these feasts fell on the Sabbath. Is that an absolute reference? I don't know if it is or not, but it does hold a lot of water. And there's a nice reference here that the reason it doesn't say the Feast of Purim is because Esther's writer didn't say the name of God, and it was kind of
Interesting. Yeah.
a shot back. But maybe, possibly, we see Jesus going to Jerusalem
I
for
think that's
Purim
probably likely.
in
Yeah.
John
And so,
chapter 5.
another point in the book of Esther's favor, even by Christ's time, they're already celebrating this feast. So it's been a thing for a while at this point already.
What
So,
verses are those?
It's John 5:1 and 5:9. If you
Somebody
stitch
wanna read?
those two things together, they would have referenced, if it had been Passover, they would have
They would have said
referenced it. And so it's obviously a minor feast, and the only minor feast on the Sabbath in that decade was this one in AD 28.
very cool. Yeah. Any other comments on that? Or anything else that we've read so far? Okay, well, let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and keep on reading verse 23 through 28. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on its own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time of the appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So we see where Purim gets its name, from those lots that Haman cast. Pur, which was, if you'll recall, I think we spoke about it back in that chapter. It comes from an Assyrian word which means stone. So likely the lots that he was using were made out of stone that had some sort of images on them. So that is where the Feast of Purim gets its name, instituted as a celebration and continued in perpetuity for Jews everywhere. Any questions on that? Any thoughts? We're wrapping up chapter 9 here pretty quick. Let's go ahead and read just these final few verses then. Then Queen Esther, this is verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regards to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Recorded in writing. Other translations say it was written in the book. So apparently, the first letter that Mordecai wrote was like more of a suggestion, and now here comes the final official proclamation that this is going to be a celebration you're going to keep forever. It says that I don't know. I don't know if this is like if Mordecai's writing with the authority of like being a Persian number 2, and this is now the law of the land in Persia, or if this is more of a thing just for the Jews to keep for themselves. I would maybe think it's probably the second. He's writing with authority. I think.
Well, it wouldn't have been given to the other Persians, but
Right.
I just wonder if it was an edict under the king's, whether it was an edict under the king's signet ring, and and a law for the Jews that lived in
Who lived
Persia.
in Persia. It could have been. It could have been, though, after the Persian Empire falls, we see this thing continuing on. Seems like it maybe had more force than just being a law of Persia, but maybe it was in fact a law for the Jews. Probably would have been had to have been confirmed by the Jews in Jerusalem. Who was the high priest at that point? There was I forget his name. Starts with a J. Anybody? I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. But he was kind of running the show there. So you'd think that the leaders in Jerusalem would probably have to have a say in this too. Maybe that was what the first letter was for, to kind of send it out to them, and then they confirm it, and then he writes this official proclamation for the Jews. It says in verse 32 that the final verse that Esther confirmed these matters, and it was written in the book, or it was recorded in writing. What book do y'all think this is? Could have been the King's Chronicles. Some people think that it's actually the book we're reading, that it's the book of Esther. That is the book that's being referenced here. We don't know, but there's a lot of people that speculate that the author is talking about this very book that's been written. So it may have been written contemporary with Esther and not after. Mm-hmm. But as we've seen, there is this undercurrent of God's providence running through this whole story, and even Jews today acknowledge that this was an act of God that saved them. So, we don't see that in the book exactly, but we can mostly agree that that's probably there. Yeah, Justin.
Have you come across estimates of how many of the Jewish people would have been spread throughout Persia versus how many returned back to Jerusalem?
Looking at it, it looked like there was 3 million spread across the whole empire. How many of those were concentrated in Jerusalem and the Promised Land, and how many were part of the diaspora at this point? I guess I don't know the number exactly. But there are plenty of them that chose not to return when they had the ability. They were still living in all of these provinces. So millions, I would think.
Yeah, it just got me wondering, back to Robert's comment about the likelihood that this would have been allowed to happen, that they would have been allowed to have this type of solidarity, even though that they were dispersed amongst all the other nations throughout Persia. Maybe this is something that helped solidify the Jewish peoples across the empire, and it allowed them to maintain that cultural significance for the next several hundred years.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a significant event that solidifies the Jews for themselves as a people, and their dedication now more to God. Before this, they're continually being pulled away by idols, and that's what's caused this whole captivity. And then after this, I mean, we have a big gap in the timeline here during the Greek Empire. But by the time of the New Testament, they've gone so much the other direction that you now have the Pharisees, who are strict by the book, religious-wise and cultural-wise. They keep to the traditions. So I think this does change the Jewish people, and I think this event is kind of the impetus for doing that. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Robert.
It does seem interesting that this might be the first, I don't know that for sure, but example of where a Jewish created holiday was mixed in with the rest of the Jewish given holidays from God. I don't know, I'm asking the historians and the audience here if anyone else knows, are there any other man-made feasts of reverence that are mixed in?
I don't know. Does anybody else know? Can anybody come up with any that were before this that weren't spelled out? You can't. Okay. Were there any other feasts or celebrations that have been created by the Jews by this point that weren't spelled out for them, like, you know, in the law? Yeah.
We'll expect a report from Robert on Sunday.
Yes. That's your assignment, Robert. Homework. Has that occurred at this point, though? I'm not sure it has. I don't think it's there yet. We don't see that. It's post New Testament there. So, okay. Well, we made it through chapter 9 pretty well here. John gets the task of creating a whole class out of 3 verses for next time. So, good luck, John. Thank you all for your comments, and we'll see everybody on Sunday.